Since Pokemon made the switch from 2D to 3D graphics, a big point of contention has been the shift from sprites to 3D models. A lot of fans have pointed out that the models, in comparisons to sprites, look much more washed and lifeless and just take away a lot of the personality that has been kind of put onto Pokemon by their sprites and their in-game poses and actions. Now that we're far enough along in the life of the 3D era of Pokemon, there have been now many generations and new designs of Pokemon that never actually had the opportunity to be designed with sprite work in mind, purely 3D modeling. So, at least in my eyes, that has made sort of critiquing or comparing those two elements a lot more difficult. However, since the release of Pokemon Legends ZA and the design of many new Mega Evolutions, we have seen the official artwork for these Mega Evolutions drop. And looking at some of these designs and comparing their artwork to their 3D modeling, it just brings back the point that has been discussed now for years about whether or not 3D models are able to capture the full life and the personality that Pokemon should be conveying. To dive a little further into this topic, I'm going to be looking through some of the designs of the new Mega Evolutions released for Legends ZA and compare their artwork to their 3D design to see where those 3D designs fall short, maybe some areas where they have strength, but ultimately to see what designs we are ultimately missing out on. When I first heard that Clefable was going to be getting a Mega Evolution and that it was going to be adding the flying type, I was super intrigued and excited by what this could look like because, quite frankly, Clefable has never been a Pokemon that has really touched me or one that I've gravitated towards, and the idea of adding a secondary type to it really excited me. And then I saw its design in Pokemon Legends ZA, and I didn't dislike it, but I was left sort of feeling that there was maybe something more or something untapped that we were missing out on. While I really liked the concept of extending the back spikes that Clefable has and turning them into wings, I just felt that the design was missing some sort of charm or energy that kept me from really resonating with it. And for the longest time, I did not know why that was until I saw the official artwork for Mega Clefable. Now, when you compare the official artwork with the 3D model, there is, I think, one key detail that stands out to me, and this is going to be the case for a lot of the designs I'm talking about, but I want to cover it now because I think there's a particular reason that this stands out on Clefable. And that factor is the outlining of the official artwork. Something that really stands out to me in the design of Mega Clefable is how empty the body and face look on the 3D model. I feel like when you look at it in game, you can hardly even see the mouth, the creases along the eyes that are sort of characteristic of Clefable become very faint, and it makes it difficult to really pick out any expression on a Pokemon that already has a very small face for such a large body. And I think that's one of the design perks that is just standard with Clefable, but when you make those small and simplistic features almost unnoticeable on its face, it's really hard, at least for me as someone who has no connection to the Pokemon, to resonate with it. When I compare the 3D model to the official artwork of Clefable, this is immediately brought to light for me. You look at the face of the artwork and you immediately see so much more expression because of those darker lines around the eyes and the darker lines around the mouth. Now, I will say that obviously the facial expression that is used in the official artwork is one that just gives more personality. It's a wide open mouth that shows enthusiasm, and it kind of gives off this dainty sort of floating fairy vibe in my eyes that the simple line mouth on the 3D model doesn't give. So maybe the point of contention should be, why do we not have that sort of open and more expressive mouth on the 3D model? But I do still think ultimately that it's losing out on those darker lines around the face that becomes really a major letdown for the 3D model. I think also that these dark lines that outline the entire body of Clefable and pretty much every other Mega Pokemon that we're going to be talking about today are really important and are something that are missed out on in the 3D models, but I understand that in any 3D modeling and even in the sprite work of a lot of the games, there were not harsh, dark outlines on every single curve of a Pokemon. But I think those facial lines, those key facial lines around the eyes and around the mouth are things that can be emphasized and should be emphasized, whether it be 2D or 3D. And the fact that they're not in 3D is really bizarre to me. And I think it's a super big reason why a lot of people see the designs of so many of the 3D models as lifeless. Something else that I think the official artwork does a lot better job of is just bringing more life to this Pokemon. The pose that Clefable has in the games is kind of just this floating, hovering, arms down by its side with the ears draping behind them look, which is fine. It's nothing horrible, but I don't think it's really anything particularly special either. But when you look at the official artwork, you see Clefable with its hands pointing up, which is kind of like this nod towards the move metronome. At least I'm assuming, because Clefable is known, I think, for using the move metronome. At least that's what I associate Clefable with. And you also have a lot more movement in the ears. They don't just drop, they kind of float back upwards to the point where you can almost see the hollowness of the inside of the ear with this little blue color that is kind of a nod to the blue in Clefable's eyes. So you just get more movement, weirdly enough, in this flat drawing of Clefable than you do in the actual moving model, which is another super bizarre thing that I'm not a huge fan of with this design. Now, quite frankly, this next Pokemon is not one that I ever envisioned myself talking about in the context of stronger design in any capacity, but I do think we cannot avoid talking about Mega Starmie. Now, I know Mega Starmie has been a huge sort of laughing stock. A lot of people are severely disappointed and even offended by the design of it just because of how little effort seems to have gone into it. But I do think that there are some strengths in the design, hear me out, that the 2D artwork gives to it that are not highlighted on by the 3D model. One thing that I noticed about Mega Starmie in the Legend ZA game that I always found kind of weird is this sort of lean that it has, and you can see it in this screenshot of the design that I'm gonna have up on screen. But it's almost like leaning forward, and there's kind of a odd bend in the legs. I honestly don't hate the design of Mega Starmie having these ridiculously long Patrick Star legs, but I felt like the way they curved and the movement of them just was awkward to me. That was the part that I struggled with, and I think that is kind of highlighted on this view of Mega Starmie. But when you look at the official artwork of it, the sort of angles that the legs take, I think give it a lot more of an interesting pose and an interesting look. You see one of Mega Starmie's legs is completely straight, and it kind of gives it something to lean back on, and the other one is sort of arched forward, not in a like slouched leaning way, but in more of a sort of ready for action, like I'm going to run at you like it does in the games sort of pose. And I think that's a much stronger pose for this Pokemon to take. And again, that leads to a concern that I have ultimately, which is why are we able to capture more movement and strong poses in a flat 2D design and not in the actual 3D moving version of the Pokemon? That is ultimately super weird, I think, and a huge concern, because how can we capture movement better in a non-moving image than we can in a moving model? I think something else that makes this artwork inherently stronger than the 3D model is the shading that we have on it. And I admit that I think that is maybe playing a really strong role here, and that would not be the case, this shading at least, to the extent here, if this was a 2D sprite. But I still do think that this kind of nod to the original Ken Sugimori shading with so much white on Starmie is really impactful in its design. One issue that I have with the 3D model for Mega Starmie is how flat it is. The colors are just super solid, apart from the sort of rainbow halo or aura that all of the Megas have around them. This Mega Starmie is essentially just 3 colors. it's the sort of bluish purple, the gold, and then the red from the eye jewel sort of thing. And there's no sort of shading, there's no dimensions to it, it's just very flat colors. And when you have these light patches shining on the body of the 2D artwork, I think it just makes the design look a lot more dynamic. It sort of looks more like an actual treasure or jewel that you would find at the bottom of the sea, as opposed to just this flat star design. And when you then compare the 3D model to this artwork, it ultimately just falls short because there's less charm and there's less sort of detail that goes into creating these sort of nice touches to it. Again, to harp on the role that I think that outlining has in really strengthening the design of Pokemon, you again get that here, which I think is nice because Starmie is not an overly complex design, whether in its mega form or its base form. But when you have these sort of black outlines that create a sort of a gap or a distinction between the body and sort of the gold outline of the eye or jewel or whatever that is exactly, and the jewel itself, I think that you get a little bit more of an intricate and complex look. In a similar way that the shading sort of adds more dimension and more complexity to the design, so does that outlining. And again, when you don't have that, I think it just ultimately makes the 3D model look a lot flatter and a lot less interesting. It's kind of crazy. The more I look at the artwork for Mega Starmie, the more I actually really start to gravitate towards its design, which is so bizarre because, again, like, I am not someone that hates the design of Mega Starmie. I think it's funny, but it's hardly what I would call one of the stronger designs. But looking at the differences between the artwork and the model, I'm just like, it's night and day. This is such a better looking Mon in the 2D form than it is in this super weird, flat, lifeless model. And I just don't understand how we are so far into the 3D era and we're still having these conversations and still talking about this as a problem. The next Pokemon I'm going to talk about is one that I actually think has a really strong design, both in the 3D model and in the 2D artwork. However, when I look at these two variations of the same Pokemon side by side, I can't help but feel that it's infinitely stronger in the 2D form, and then it just makes me sort of annoyed that this is not the complete version that we got. The Pokemon I'm talking about is the starter I picked for the game, which is Emboar, and thus Mega Emboar. I think Mega Emboar is undoubtedly, in my eyes, the strongest design of the 3 starter Pokemon in this game. I really like the addition of the fire staff and the additional flames around the neck being accentuated, and ultimately I think it's just a really cool way to upgrade the whole look that Emboar has. That being said, when I look at this 2D artwork for Emboar, I'm kind of realizing a couple things about the 3D design that actually kind of annoy me a little bit. I think, similarly to Clefable, the main point of contention to me is the face. When I look at the face of Mega Emboar and its 2D artwork, I see a strong and fierce emperor with sort of a scowl and at the same time a confident smirk, right? Like, there's a real personality there. There's a real confidence that this Pokemon knows its strength. And I really like that because I think that's very appropriate for the design and for the type of Pokemon that this is. But I don't get this same feeling from the face of the 3D model. Instead, I see kind of a silly pig that is ultimately really strong, but almost just ends up looking more like it has a unibrow and a big mouth with funny teeth sticking out of it. Now, I will say maybe it is the fact that on this 2D artwork, you can see the Pokemon from straight on, face to face, and maybe that angle helps a little bit, but I still feel that, yet again, when you have the strong black line to be the mouth, it ends up looking just fiercer. And I just think that, again, we're missing out on that in the 3D model. Something else that I can't help but notice when I'm comparing the 3D model to the 2D artwork is that the 3D iteration just seems a little bit wider. Now, I don't mean to body shame my boy Emboar here, because I'm not even necessarily talking about its body. I'm talking about the flames. When you look at the flames that come out from its neck below its face, in the 3D model, they flare outwards. but when you look at the 2D art, they sort of come straight up, if that makes sense. And I think that makes the silhouette, especially towards the top, seem just a tad sleeker and a little cleaner in my eyes. And maybe that is just like a design feature that they ultimately noticed later on and got to fix in the artwork, but I still think that's kind of annoying that we have to deal with that. The other thing I notice about this sort of wideness comes through the bottom half of Emboar's design. This sort of additional fur that comes at the bottom of the design on the 3D model almost seems to stick out extra. And to me, I can't shake the thought that it just looks like Emboar is wearing pants, like a pair of furry pants that it's pulled on, because they don't seem to naturally flow with the rest of the design. This is not an issue that I see in the 2D model, because when you look at the artwork, there is just a natural flow of the body from where this sort of extra fur starts and where those sort of designs on the stomach are as well. So like there's not this sort of disconnect between these parts that, again, I think just makes the design look a little sleeker and a little cleaner. And I know that Emboar, the big, strong Fire Emperor pig, is not supposed to be a sleek design, but I think ultimately when the design feels a little cleaner, that is really important, and it's concerning that we can't get that in the finished product of the game, is it not? As much as I do think that these are issues and concerns with Emboar, I also will concede that this is super nitpicky, and I think these are problems I have as someone who not only, one, really likes Gen 5 and thus has a soft spot for Emboar, and two, also just thinks this is the best design. I'm being like a little bit more nitpicky about it because there aren't, I think, super huge flaws. But yet again, when we're seeing sort of the same issues of a lack of sort of cohesiveness in the design, a lack of personality in the facial expression of the Pokemon, I do think it is cause for concern, especially when this is like potentially your starter Pokemon, the Pokemon that should be the closest to you in your journey. You should be able to see a personality and have a bit of a connection to that. Now, I have a lot of strong feelings and opinions about the design of the next Mega Pokemon we're going to be talking about, because that Pokemon is actually my favorite Pokemon, at least right now. I think that can kind of change sometime, but that's a topic for a different video. That Pokemon is Mega Excadrill. Now, I love Excadrill for multiple reasons, which I don't have to delve into necessarily right now to talk about this design. But what I have a problem with when it comes to Mega Excadrill is two main design components. The first of these is the head area. So I know obviously that Excadrill has been given this overly accentuated drill on top of its head, and I don't hate that as a design feature. What I think is super bizarre is this additional piece of the forehead that gets added that we never see it on regular Excadrill. I don't think it has that. I know, granted, whenever we see regular Excadrill, it's always sort of faced downwards this way, so you can't really see this portion of the head, and Mega Excadrill is more upwards, so you can, but it seems super bizarre to me to add this like additional forehead that kind of ends up turning into a unibrow above its face. Now, granted, this is not something you can see all of the time on Mega Excadrill. I think you can pretty much only see it from like the head on slightly lower angle, but I think it is still weird, and I think that it's something that doesn't make a lot of sense to me personally. Now, granted, I know that this is a design feature that is still present on the 2D sprite or the 2D artwork. However, I feel that it's just handled better. The sort of forehead comes to a much sharper point and doesn't feel quite as like steep. So it almost looks more like it's just there supporting the drill, which that as like a design feature I can get behind and I can understand, because that makes sense to me. It's got like such this large drill that it needs additional like forehead to support it, which is weird, I guess, but I can kind of get behind when it doesn't look like the Pokemon has a 5 head and a unibrow. I think the other thing that is just dealt with a lot better in the face is the nose. The nose of Mega Excadrill, I think, looks kind of awkward and sort of big and bulbous, but when, yet again, you bring in the black outline, it kind of sharpens things up a little bit and makes it look less full and awkward to me. This would not be a critique on the 3D modeling if I did not point out again that I think that the eyes and mouth are infinitely stronger on the 2D design because of the fact that there is these dark black outlines around them. The design is made so much stronger by the fact that the mouth is outlined in a dark black. It looks much sharper. It shows off the fierce look on Excadrill's face much better. Additionally, the little outlines around the eyes, the rings that it has, are like almost invisible. I could not tell that they were there originally on the 3D model, but they are perfectly visible on the 2D, and once again sort of add to the fierceness of the design that I think is much more appropriate and gives it just an ultimately less goofy look. In addition to the difference in the face, I think there's also just a difference in the general posture and body of Excadrill in the 3D model than there is in the 2D design. When you look at the 3D model, the shape of his frame is kind of strange. There's kind of like a puffed out chest look, but the shape of it is a little awkward, and even the arms and the way they connect to the body just kind of seem like attached, like it doesn't have a natural connection. They just look kind of like they're awkwardly jutting out at the shoulder. But then when you look at the 2D model, yet again, it just has more of like an Excadrill shape, really. Like his torso seems more rounded, which is more in line with the regular shape of Excadrill. Even the posture of the 2D Excadrill just seems to make more sense. Instead of being sort of like arched forward, with arms jutting straight out, it's kind of leaned back, almost like the weight of those heavy drills is causing him to slouch. And even the arms seem to be more naturally tucked and not jutting out of his sides. So I just feel like just the general posture of the design that they've given here makes a lot more sense on the 2D design than on the 3D model, which I hate to say the same thing so many times, but it's like, how do you get the movement and the like that sort of stuff so much more correct in a design that isn't actually moving? It's so bizarre. But yeah, this design definitely is the one that, I had grown to accept and appreciate Mega Excadrill in the game, especially because I think it's a really overpowered mon. But then when you see this 2D design, I'm like, it could have looked so much better, Like, even if you're not crazy about the direction of this design, it just objectively looks so much better as a 2D model or as a 2D artwork. And like, even the drills, like look at the drills seem sharper, they seem more fierce and ready, and I don't understand exactly how that happens. Those are the 4 mega evolutions that really stood out to me as having significant faults and downsides in their 3D modeling that is significantly corrected by the 2D art. And that is by no means the only few that I think suffer from this issue. There are plenty that I think are solid designs that look good in the game that are just happen to look better with the pose or designs they use in the 2D. There are some that I just quite frankly don't think even the 2D designs save them. But I hope you guys enjoyed listening to me talk about this for a little bit. I don't know if there's really a positive conclusion to take here, other than the fact that I think most of us really hope that we get 2D Pokemon games back at some point, even if it's just some sort of remake or ode to a previous game. Will that ever happen? I don't know, but I would love to see some of these newer mons that haven't had sprite work have the opportunity to be represented in that way by the franchise. Thank you guys again so much for watching, and take care.